Dimensions are different ways of categorizing financial transactions, primarily for reporting and analysis purposes. That's essentially what they are. They're like data tags that you associate with journal entry or an invoice, but primarily with journal entries for analyzing, profit and loss, primarily your income statement. And the most common one that everybody uses is a department. So that's your research and development, your sales and marketing, general administrative. That's the typical one that everybody uses. So your operating expenses, you would tag all your spending, your salaries, your vendor costs, your depreciation, with a department. And Business Central, so it's different than your chart of accounts, although related. So in some systems, sort of older systems, Dynamics GP, for example, the chart of accounts would include both your natural account, and a natural account is how you would categorize your high-level lines on a balance sheet or income statement. So cash, prepaids, accounts payable, salary, interest expense, your traditional spending categories. And in some systems, the dimension would be part of that string. So you would have salaries for finance, salaries for research, salaries for marketing. You might even have a business unit in there or a product code or something like that. In Business Central and most systems, it's a separate field. So you're going to have your natural chart of accounts as a column field. You'll have all your dimensions as separate fields. So you can kind of, if you think of a pivot table, they can be different filters or different groupings, ways to build hierarchies of financial transactions. So you can create as many dimensions as is needed. It's a bit of a balance because you have to think about data entry. Data entry is sort of the cost of a dimension, and then reporting is the benefit. So you have to weigh how many dimensions you want to record with the transaction, how they're being recorded. Generally, there's 3 transactions. You got a customer invoice, a vendor invoice, or a journal entry. Those are your 3 main transactions. How the user would enter those dimensions. So you don't want to go too far. I mean, eventually they become useful, less useful, maybe something between at least a department and then maybe 3 or 4 more, five more is kind of common. I've seen some go up as high as 8 to 10. Very rarely do you go any higher than that. But some examples of dimensions, like I said, are departments, project, maybe a product family or a product hierarchy of some sort, a customer group. So like maybe a market, if your customers are in different market segments, distributor, direct, geographic region in the world, things like that. You could have trade shows or people, things like that. Anything you kind of start with what are your key reports that management uses to run the business? What are the key metrics that are required? And you start from there, and those will define what your dimensions really are. It's what you need to sort of slice and dice your data on, and then you build them from that. So on the screen here is the dimensions, where you would create the number of dimensions. They have a code and a name, and then within each dimension are the actual dimension values themselves. So Um, for department, it would be something like R&D, sales and marketing, G&A. And then you might have a hierarchy. So within maybe G&A, you have, I see I've got here admin, maybe finance, maybe HR, IT, some broad categories. And then G&A could be a high level view of the dimension. So within G&A, you would have admin, finance, HR, IT, and then it would be a total. So you can kind of build a hierarchy where you can kind of drill down on dimensions for however many subtotals you want. The lowest level being where you actually post transactions to, and then it rolls up, right? Just like a chart of accounts would. So you can kind of drill down in a sort of a hierarchical way from a reporting standpoint. So you define which dimensions you want to report on, what the actual values and hierarchy is within the dimensions. And then you create the data entry rules for dimensions. So this is where you can create defaults that would help streamline data entry. And this happens a lot, mainly on the customer side. So items can have a default product family or product code, and that would be a pretty much one-to-one relationship for a product. Every time you sell a product, it would be related to a certain product family. Every customer would generally have a defined customer group or region that wouldn't change. So in that case, you can create defaults, and within the item card or customer card or vendor card, you can create a default for that particular dimension. And it can be multiple dimensions. So in this case, maybe I'm going to create a market, and I'm going to require it. And I'm going to say it's always going to be this code. And it could be multiple values here. This is getting a bit into the details, but basically for the rules, you can define them as mandatory, which means it requires a value, but the user can input and determine which value it is. Or you can create a selection of allowable ones, so some subset of different dimensions that could be used for that particular item, customer, or vendor. You can make it to be only one value, so it always has to be a value. This is sort of what the case of a default value. Code saying would mean it has to be this value. If the user tries to change it, it would cause an error in posting. Or it's not allowed to have any value. So basically 3 options: any value, but at least you populate it with a value, always a specific value, or no value at all. So where I see this defaults a lot is on item cards, customer cards, and the GL. I don't see it very much on the vendor, mainly because vendors tend to, you buy different things for with vendors. They might, a particular vendor might be a supplier for your R&D group, for your finance group, for your sales and marketing group. A default doesn't sort of make sense for a vendor unless you're buying, that vendor is always going to supply or mostly supply it for a specific department or something. Then you can set a default. But items, it works very well with customers. And the other place where it makes a lot of sense is on the chart of accounts. And within the chart of accounts, it's the same rules, the same sort of logic of building a rule, but it's not quite it's a bit different perspective. So whereas putting it on a item card and a customer card, it's creating a default more from an entry standpoint. It's going to sort of pull in those values when you create an invoice for that item or customer. On the chart of accounts, it's more of a controlling it on the output side. So it's basically saying it has to include a specific value. So in the case of a customer item, we would usually use code same, which means this record is always going to include it. On the chart of accounts, the most obvious rule, which almost all customers use, is that it's just required. So in the case of operating expenses, you'd always want to be able to look at all spending by a department. So you would want to create sort of a report that says, here's my salaries and the total of everything booked to R&D, sales and marketing, G&A equals my total that was booked to salaries. You don't want this non-categorized other. You want to require every entry that gets booked to operating expense to have some department, not a particular department, but some department. So we would create a rule here, and similar to what we did on the item, but this time we're going to pick code mandatory and just leave it blank. What's going to happen here is that when somebody tries to post any entry to the trial balance, not just the journal entry, but any AR or AP invoice, it will not let you post unless there's, in this case, a department on it. It makes for cleaner financial statements by dimensions. You may have revenue require say maybe all of these are always going to be booked by an invoice. So that means they're going to have an item and a customer. And if we set all our items up to have a customer group, it should have a value here. So we'll say code mandatory. Everything in revenue is going to have customer group and maybe a market. Now you can create financial statements just for revenue, and you can look at them by customer group, by market, and it will always total up. There won't be this uncategorized revenue amount that didn't have a value for these two dimensions. So that's sort of the configuration for dimensions. That's creating the dimensions and creating the rules around data entry. The other topic is reporting. So more of the sort of back end, that after you book something, how do the reports look? And there's they're all pretty much around account schedules. Obviously, you can create Power BI reports and lists, which can filter or create pivot tables with the dimensions. But I'll cover account schedules here. So within, say, the income statement, you're going to have these columns available. It's going to have the dimensions within it. So a normal account schedule, you'll just tell every line in your financial statement what chart of accounts is included in it. But you can also add subtotals for your dimensions. And this, by default, they don't show up. So you're going to have to go to personalize this, add the field, and add your dimensions in here as a column. So how this works is now what's on this line is going to be the combination of what you put in here as the chart of account, as well as the department. So we'll call this S&M and G&A. So you can see these all have the same accounts. It's the total of all operating expenses. It wouldn't make sense if on the report, it would without these filters, it'll just show total operating expense 3 times on this, and it won't make sense. But with these filters, this particular line will say, show me all operating expense that's coded to R&D, show all operating expense that's coded to sales and marketing and general administrative, and then total. So when it runs this report, the value that shows here plus the value here will be the value here. Nothing will be in blank, because we've created a rule that requires these values to be entered, so that it should fit correctly on the financial statement. This applies to any dimension. So you could create another account schedule that's just revenue, and you do it by customer segment, product family. It doesn't have to be just your traditional P&L. It can be a revenue analysis report, a cost of goods sold analysis report by whatever dimension you created. So what this does is your traditional account schedules are lines, SG&A, sales and marketing down the side, vertically as your row, and your columns are generally time periods, rolling 12 months or 4 quarters or budget versus actual. It's a time-based column. There's another way when you have dimensions of creating account schedules, and that is with analysis views. And what this does is create more like a matrix style report, where you've got the same chart of accounts vertically as rows, but across the top is your dimensions. So it's basically a particular point in time, say a month or year to date, the total of spending by account and by department, or revenue by account, by customer group, or by product family. So it's generally a fixed period of time, but now you can put your dimension values across the top. So analysis views is a way to do it, to another sort of layout for financial information using dimensions. Let's see if this will say by department. Not a lot of data in here, but you get the gist. So you got your different accounts. This makes more sense when you get to expenses. Not much booked in here, but you can see across the top that there's all the different departments. And then had there been anything booked for these departments, it would have a value. I'd say the other thing to note is after you booked an entry, there's a way, and this is a relatively newer feature, maybe the last 6 months or so. You can correct any mistakes or things that are booked to the wrong dimension. Rather than rebooking a whole new journal entry, you can change the value. So for example, this salaries expense was booked to marketing, but maybe it should have been booked to a different department. So we can go to correct dimensions. And then we're going to say new value is, call it engineering. And then run it. Basically, what this would do is change the value to a new department without having to book a new entry. So a little quicker way of fixing your dimensions.